Hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Simon Hodgkins. Today, a real pleasure to be joined by Jeannette Linfoot. Jeannette is very welcome to the show. She's a corporate CEO turned entrepreneur, and as a board advisor, a mentor, an investor, and a host of other strings to the bow. It's great because we're going to be able to get into a conversation about helping business leaders, helping the C-suite executives, and helping those businesses and those, from startups to the very largest companies. How do they scale and grow in today's modern, complex, busy environment? So with over 3 decades of global expertise, hopefully we're in for a great discussion here when it comes to being brave, bold, and brilliant. 3 words that I know are very meaningful to Jeannette, and maybe I'll let her describe why those are meaningful words to her. So look, let's get into it. There's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of topics to get into today. Jeannette, welcome to VistaTalks.
Thank you, Simon. How lovely to be here.
It's our pleasure, absolutely. Now, I started off in the introduction by saying, look, you've transitioned from being C-suite corporate CEO, and I know you've got a long track history of working with some very, very big organizations, some very complex situations, but now, becoming entrepreneur and mentor really to those same C-suite executives. Can you tell us what inspired the shift? Where did that come about, and how maybe some of your experience from the corporate world influences the work that you do today with business leaders and decision makers?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as I say, thank you again for having me on. It's great to be here. My background is primarily in the travel industry, although I did start life as a government economist in Whitehall in terms of my first proper job. But I jumped into the travel industry, and I was one of those people where just loved the industry, progressed from the bottom, starting on a graduate scheme right the way up to becoming CEO. So, it's an industry that I love. So when I decided to make the shift out of corporate world to essentially going down the plural career route of having a portfolio of my own businesses, it wasn't on the back of not enjoying my career. Some people are sack the boss, and all that kind of stuff. So that wasn't me. I really enjoyed the businesses I ran. The last corporate roles that I was in, I was the CEO of the travel division for Saga, which is a FTSE 250 listed business. And then before that, I was the managing director of the emerging markets for TUI. So I used to run the businesses in China, India, set TUI up in Russia and Ukraine, etc., etc. So, kind of big corporate roles really, but having worked my way up from the bottom. But I think I got to a point in my career, Simon, sort of around about 47, so mid-40s, where I just thought, actually, I've really enjoyed my career, but what I want to do now is have more freedom, choice, flexibility, create multiple streams of income, and be able to, I guess, be a little bit more selective around who I worked with, which projects I got involved in, and which businesses I chose to support. So that was really the catalyst. And then just on a personal basis, I think it's always important to look at your overall family situation, your, personal life, because business is one thing, but we only have one life, right? So I was at a time when my partner, Chris, he's 10 years older than me. And whilst that's not an issue, we were very conscious of saying, well, what do we want the next phase of our life to look like? So actually moving into more of a plural career worked really well, both sort of professionally, but also personally as well. So that was the catalyst. And then what I've got now today is a property investment business. I have an advisory business. I also do one-to-one business mentoring with senior execs and normally business owners that are looking to scale up or sell. And I have a podcast as well. So we maybe talk about that in a little while. But so I've gone down that plural route, and I get to work with some incredible brands globally to support the CEOs on their strategy and growth journeys. So yeah, it's cool. I love it.
Well, look, I can hear just from the way you're talking, there's obviously passion there in everything that you're doing. You mentioned 2 really big brands in the travel space, Saga, FTSE 250, very well-known market-listed organization, and TUI, of course. I mean, they're current at the time of recording. They seem to be advertising everywhere I look. They seem to have huge growth and scale on their agenda for sure. And they're sort of right up there when it comes to those top global CEO type experiences that you can bring to the table. Now, you mentioned the podcast, and at the start, when I was sort of introducing you, I talked about three words: being brave, being bold, and being brilliant. So could you tell us, maybe, seeing as though you've raised the topic, tell us about the podcast? Because not only is this something that you obviously love doing, and you're helping C-suites, leaders, entrepreneurs, and businesses to scale, but you're also recognized as being in that very upper echelon of global podcasts, right? So tell us a bit about that. How did it come about? How's it going? And what does the audience get when they tune into that brave, bold, brilliant frequency?
Fantastic. Well, essentially, I never thought I would be a podcast host, Simon. If you'd asked me that when I was stood for presenting the annual results to the analysts in the city, I wouldn't have said I was going to be a podcaster. But hey, here we are, and I absolutely love it. But essentially, I started the podcast 4 years ago when COVID hit, and I had a little bit more time on my hands, which was great because it allowed me to be creative. So started the podcast, and essentially, we're now on episode, gosh, I think 438 and counting. So top 1.5% of podcasts globally. But essentially what I am privileged to do is to have super interesting conversations with corporate CEOs, entrepreneurs, business leaders, elite sports people around the concept of, well, what does it mean to be brave, bold, brilliant, and getting to understand the real person behind the role. So it's very much around keeping it real, the highs, the lows, so that it's there to support, guide, inspire. And then every Friday I do a solo episode, which is normally based on a topic around, it might be finance, might be building a great team, it might be some mindset stuff. So yeah, it's kind of grown arms and legs, but what's actually happened, Simon, is what started as the name for the podcast has now become a brand. So it's the ecosystem which we have in terms of all that we offer, whether that's executive development, whether it's bespoke advisory work, whether it's one-to-one mentoring. So, as a brand, it's really resonated with people, which is great, absolutely great. So yeah, it started as a podcast, but has now become a whole ecosystem of brave, bold, brilliant. So we've got some really exciting things coming down the track. Yeah, but really cool. Love it.
Wow. Great to see that it's become a brand in itself and a vehicle for lots of the activities that you're doing. And I wanted to ask you, if I can, because obviously people listening to this, they have an interest in growing their international business, whether it's going into new countries, new cultures. And I want to ask you, as a board advisor, you must see common challenges or even unique challenges with some of these brands that you're working with, what they're facing when they're trying to adapt to, whether it's culture and language, or whether it's technology, whether it's current global business trends or worldwide events that are impacting them. Is there any sort of common threads that run through your work, or is every single, top 500 company completely unique and you have to start from scratch? How does that work in your world, Jeanette?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely common themes, and I think from my perspective, when I work with clients, I'm always coming from the point of view of I've sat in that seat or a similar seat, so it's not just a theoretical consultant coming in doing a nice PowerPoint presentation, although there can be a place for that, of course. So it's much more around a very grounded perspective, working hand in glove with the business owner or the CEO. But I think when it comes to international expansion, international growth, it's really important, I think, to think global but act local. So, if you're a large brand with a global reach, obviously the, integrity of the brand, the values, what you stand for needs to be consistent, right? Because if someone is having an experience in China or India or France, you want that to be pretty common because your brand standards will be consistent. But the localization of it, bringing in, localized experience, as you said, language, culture, the ways of doing business are significantly different in different parts of the world. And I think the biggest mistake that I see with large international corporates, whether it's American organization or European organization going into Asia or wherever it may be, is the mistake is, don't think you can enter that market and apply the same way of doing business as you do in a Western developed world, because you will fail. You know, there are nuances, there's different social norms, culture is a big thing, language, you know, and also legal, tax, very, very different. You know, you've got to be thinking a lot more in advance before you enter a market, all of these, you know, elements before you get started, because you only get one chance to make a first impression. So you want to have done your homework, really, really understand, is this a market that you can win in? What's the competitor landscape? You might have very maverick competitors. Certainly when I set TUI up in Russia and Ukraine with 3 acquisitions under a joint venture, obviously terrible to see what's been happening, you know, over the last sort of year or so. But the ways of doing business was so different, you know, so you've got to think about your competitor set. So there's a lot to take into account, but I think the most important thing is to understand the market, understand the customer locally, what they want, understand how, you know, your teams need to be engaged with. And if you are sending, you know, Western Europeans or American colleagues into these markets, you need to set them up for success with great cultural training, you know, really with the right support network around them, because you can be in some quite harsh environments here. So yeah, it's exciting. It always takes a lot longer. So whatever time frame you have, probably double it. And it will always cost you a lot more than you anticipate as well. So you need a contingency in your investment budget. So those are just a few thoughts really, but there are definitely some common elements. But think global, act local would be my overall summary.
Oh, I think they're great points, and thank you very much indeed for sharing those insights. And you mentioned language and localization, obviously a topic we're very interested in here too. But based on your extensive experience, what I want to ask you is about, once you have that set up, because you kind of mentioned as you were talking earlier that you've been that person that has to stand up and present the results to the market because it's a listed company, it's an organization that's on one of the global stock markets. You've set up these large operations in international, you know, areas and geographies. You've experienced that cultural impact that you have to get right. But when you've got that initial traction going, is there any strategies that you'd recommend for companies when they have to manage that internal and external communication across those different regions effectively? I'm thinking like hub and spoke type organizations, or maybe the head office, and then you've got all these other new ventures that you've set up across the world. And it gets quite complex quite quickly, doesn't it, in terms of managing that? And then when you add in language and culture on top of that, getting it right as a large organization takes a little bit of thinking and strategy. What are your thoughts on that, Jeanette?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. So there's internal and there's external comms, right? So let's talk about internal comms first, because you know normally your business is your people, regardless of sector. So I think you have to be very conscious around conveying consistent messages to all of your global teams. Now that means navigating through time zones normally, because you're trying to find a time of day when, you know, in Australia it might be 11 hours ahead, and in you know Western US it might be 8 hours behind. So it can be challenging in that perspective. And you also do have to think about, you will probably have, and I am generalizing so I don't want to offend anyone, but you're probably, your common business language is most likely to be English overall, just because of, you know, kind of markets, especially if you're listed in you know in the US or in the UK, etc. So you know your common business language will be English. But remember, depending who you're talking to, if you're talking to the leadership team and at an ex-com level, it's probably fine to communicate in English. But if that is being translated out to a wider audience, the entire organization, you need to have translators available. You need to have them set up. So if you're doing a live webinar or something like that, you need the tech really, so that people that are listening can listen in their local language. Equally, if it's written comms, you know, make sure you've got a slick process whereby written comms is translated into local language. So again, that can all take a bit more time than if you're just communicating in one market. So I think it's around the planning. It's around having a calendar of communications. If you're doing town halls, maybe they're once a month, you know, and actually really understanding about the cascade of information. So consistency of messages, but then equally allowing, I suppose, the localized MDs or CEOs or leaders in those markets to also kind of flow that out using their own style. So with a framework, but allowing some of that localization without losing the consistency. So it takes planning. You need a good internal comms, you need great tech, and you need to really be respectful of language and nuances as well. Look and feel can also be very different. A website designed for the Chinese market looks totally different to a website designed for, a Western European market. So yeah, I think it's around having the right insight on the ground that can help you shape that communication plan in terms of what's appropriate. And then with external comms, you'll be dealing with suppliers, with potential investors, with the markets, all of those different stakeholders. So I always had great translators, for key business meetings. If you're doing a deal, you've got to know that you're able to communicate, even if you don't have a shared language. Chinese was the most difficult, actually, Mandarin, I found. So again, more time, you've got to be very aware of cultural norms, how to take someone's business card, how to receive it, look at it, how you pay respect. So all those what you seem like little details really make a difference between, are you going to actually make this a success and get the deal over the line or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've touched on some excellent points there. And of course, that's before we even get into the content, the product, the service, and how you communicate that to these new audiences that you're connecting with. But thank you for sharing those insights again. And let's talk a little bit about technology, if I can, because I want to move that on. So whether it's real-time translation, transcription, whether it's AI helping with the localization, but also just broader than that, maybe in terms of various industries. So obviously you've got great knowledge and expertise, from your days in the travel and hospitality type sectors, but you work with lots of businesses in lots of different areas now, and you must see technology, AI, obviously,
Mm.
driving innovation, making changes in these organizations. And my question is, what do businesses need to think about if they need to focus and to stay ahead of that curve? Is that even possible today? And are you seeing technology help or hinder, or a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B? What's the landscape like when you're working with these companies talking about scale? Because technology just seems to be ferociously changing every time
Mm.
you pick up the news.
Yeah, you're right. The pace of change of tech is much faster now than ever. I think, the pace of change. So as a CEO, you need to make sure that you're also keeping your finger on the pulse. And that might be via, someone on your, a team that you have around market intelligence, or, your CIO, etc. So it's not just, I think, whereas before tech was seen as this is something that the CTO deals with, or the IT director, or maybe the marketing people. Whereas now you can't have it sitting in those little functional boxes. As a CEO, as an MD, you might not be a technical whiz, but you need to be informed around what's going on enough so that you can make some good investment choices. And also be thinking. I always try to think about, who are you trying to benefit? So it's customer, obviously, colleagues, employees, and other stakeholders. So there's a whole bunch of people that AI, as an example, can really support. So I'm seeing businesses that are embracing AI and actually seeing it as an opportunity to improve. I don't think it's necessarily, and this is where people are getting it wrong, saying it's about cutting costs. It's not. To me, it's always, if you're in a service-led industry, it's that combination between tech and people. But what something like AI can do is get you a saving of efficiency and time in one area that then allows you to put those resources into offering a better customer experience for the more human to human elements. So I think, for me, it is around how you get that right combination. Robotics. We've just bought a Hoover that goes around and cleans. I mean, it's incredible. Goes around the house. I love it. Absolutely. We've called a Vicky the Vac. So all these different things are kind of going on. So you've got to have your finger on the pulse, and you've got to also be thinking around how can this benefit the customer, your teams, and any other stakeholders that are important.
Yeah, it's interesting. From Vicky the Vac to one of the episodes that I recorded recently. in a medical setting, the amount of technology that's being poured into, just mentioning robotics, into real-time training is incredible. And AI, of course, it's this sort of huge wave of technology that we're all grasping with today.
Mm.
But I do like what you've said about having that human relationship, and we talk a lot about human in the loop, or more commonly, human at the core, because ultimately it's that, as you say, human to human relationship that still counts. So thank you for that. Now, when it comes to other strategies, whether that's culturally sensitive or whether it's emerging trends, is there anything businesses need to be thinking about when it comes to remaining competitive? Because we see some big brands come and go. We see some big brands really suffer, and we see others really gain momentum. Is there anything from remaining competitive? How do you keep ahead in that C-suite environment that,
Mm.
boards and companies need to be thinking about constantly, Jeanette?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's always a juggle, right? Because you've got to be careful around eroding your core business. So you want to be competitive and edgy and always looking at where the next trend in innovation is coming. But very often that can be a shiny penny that distracts you from your core offering. So we've got so many examples of organizations that have diversified too far and have therefore actually lost the focus on what they actually really, the DNA and what they offer at the core. So it's always this balance between, being ahead of the game and driving forward change and, responding to different customer needs, but at the same time, being really clear about how you extract value from your core offering and business and what you stand for. So I would always say, as a leader, you need to be able to be clear on, where are you testing and learning some initial ideas that might then materialize into significant additional business sectors for you, but at the same time not neglecting your kind of core, really. So it's this constant juggle. So I think having a longer term view is important, so any good business should have a minimum 3-year plan, but 5-year plan. But I also think you want to have an element of innovation incubation where you do test and learn. You have the ability, and some businesses do this quite well, and they almost set it up as a separate business like a startup. Large organizations struggle with this, to be honest, because it tends to get swallowed by the big machine. But you need some kind of innovation incubator to be able to test and learn. But at the same time, having some allocated budgets for that is difficult, but can be really helpful at the same time. So yeah, it's a constant evolution, isn't it? But I think, as a business leader, there's a lot to be said about incremental gains. 1% improvement in all of your core metrics will amount to a significant improvement in your bottom line. So sometimes we go for the big glamorous change and that can be great, and the big innovation, but are you actually, converting your sales calls by 1% better every month? Because if you were doing that, you'd probably make a lot more money. So, it's about this constant juggling, I think, around innovation, but not losing sight of the core, but having a plan, having a clear strategy, and that shouldn't really be swinging around too much, but at the same time, having this little space for innovation that allows you to test and learn. And then when something becomes interesting enough, you go, okay, great. Now this is significant enough for us to bring it in as a real core part of our organization and offering.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's very smart. And I think that incubation R&D area within an enterprise where you can actually try new things, it's so important. And you're right. I mean, where you use terms about like eroding your core sort of market or your core offerings or services. And sometimes the new and the exciting goes slightly in a different direction to what you're doing traditionally. And that's where that sort of entrepreneurial tension kicks in. And that's quite difficult in the complex C-suite global enterprise type environment. Before we wrap up, Jeanette, I got to ask you two more things. I want to ask you about, is there anything that we haven't touched on or any further advice or insights that you'd like to share with our audience? And the other part of that question is, if people want to connect with you, they want to find out more about what you do, or maybe they want to tune into the podcast and find out more about this topic today, where's the best place to send them to? So two questions there, maybe to come towards the end of our time together today.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think, for any business leader or anyone running a team or, an entrepreneur, I always, and it is aligned with my brand actually, but I always believe that there are three elements to success, regardless of what sector you're in or regardless of the size of the organization. So, the first part, brave, it's about leading yourself. Are you investing in your own personal development? Are you being the leader, being the CEO that you want to be? Because if you're not in good shape, then you cannot lead your teams effectively. You can't do the best for the organization. So, brave is often about confronting those elements in yourself as a leader. So don't neglect that. So that's really important. The second part, bold, leading the business. What's the strategy? What's the plan? What's the investment case? Is that clear? How are you bringing all of that to market? How does that affect your market capitalization, your share price? It's having a really clear boldness around leading the business. And then the third element for me, the brilliance, is creating high performing teams. So regardless of whether you're an SME, whether you're a huge corporate, you've always got to be leading yourself, leading the business, leading your teams. And if you're going off track, it's normally because one of those elements, or it might be multiple elements, are not quite aligned or focused. So just use that simple framework to bring you back to make sure that you're paying attention where you should be. So I think, that's one thing. And I would just really say, there's a formula for success as well as using that framework. And it really is about belief. Belief in what you're doing, belief in yourself, belief in your teams, having a clear purpose. What's your why? Why do you exist? And just taking massive action, because that's when you're going to get results, right? Though that kind of formula, really. So those would be some parting words, if you like, for anyone, whether you're a solopreneur or you're a corporate CEO running a multi-billion-dollar business globally. Same principles apply. And just in terms of where people can find me, social media is great, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, you name it. Obviously, we've got the podcast in terms of Brave, Bold, Brilliant, which you'll find on all the normal platforms, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. And we've got a YouTube channel as well called Brave, Bold, Brilliant, which we're actually just doing some work on that. But importantly, check out the website, which is www.brave-bold-brilliant.com, because on there, you're going to see how we can help you. But there's a huge resource section as well, whether it's videos, blogs, downloadable guides, templates. And there's a lot of good stuff there that you can just access for free and join the community, because that's where we can really engage and support each other. So yeah, that's probably it, Simon, from me.
Well, that's a great note to end on. And that brings us nicely to the end of today's show with Jeannette Linfoot. I want to make sure that people tune in again to listen or watch the next VistaTalks show, where we'll be again discussing some more interesting topics with interesting people from all around the world, just like Jeannette. But thanks for being on the show, Jeannette. Great to talk to you again today.
Thank you for having me, Simon. Appreciate it.